The morning Nora Bell drove her first stake into the dry Texas earth. She had blisters on both palms, $43 to her name, and absolutely no intention of making friends with the man who owned the land next door. It was the spring of 1878, and the flat stretch of Caldwell County, Texas, was just beginning to bloom with the kind of stubborn wildflowers that had no business surviving in soil that hard. Nora had arrived 3 weeks prior on the afternoon stage from San Antonio, carrying 2 trunks, a seed tin that had belonged to her mother, and a land deed that her late husband, Gerald Bell, had purchased 6 months before his heart gave out on the kitchen floor of their rented room. Gerald had been a dreamer. He had talked about the land in Caldwell County, the way other men talked about gold. He had drawn maps on the backs of envelopes, measured out rows of crops with his finger on the table, and promised Nora that by the time she was 30, she would have a porch wide enough to hold a rocking chair on each end. She was 27 now, and Gerald was gone, and the porch did not exist yet, but the land did. That was something. The property she had inherited through his deed was a long, narrow rectangle of Texas ground that sat between 2 larger parcels. To the east was a stretch of land belonging to the county itself, mostly used as a cattle trail. To the west was land that, according to the deed and the survey map the clerk in town had reluctantly pulled out for her, belonged to one Tobias Wallace. She had not met Tobias Wallace yet. She only knew his name from the property documents and from the way old Mr. Hargrove at the general store had mentioned him in passing, the way men mention things they think a woman ought to be warned about. Wallace is particular about his land, Mr. Hargrove had said, handing her a sack of flour with the slow deliberateness of a man who believed flour was more important than advice. He and Gerald had a survey dispute, never fully settled. I didn't know, Nora had said. Well, you do now, she did. And so when she drove her stake into the ground along what she believed to be the western boundary of her property, she drove it with the full awareness that whoever Tobias Wallace was, he might eventually have something to say about it. She was prepared to let him say it. The cabin on her property was small and in terrible shape. The roof on the south side had partially caved during a winter storm. The front door hung from only one hinge, and something had been living under the floorboards for long enough to have developed opinions about it. Nora spent the first week clearing it out, patching what she could, and sleeping under a wagon canvas tacked above the one dry corner of the bedroom. She was practical about misery. She had been practicing for years. In the second week, she began to turn over soil. She had brought seeds for tomatoes, squash, pole beans, sweet peppers, and a particular variety of yellow marigold her mother had grown every summer in Tennessee. The marigolds were not practical. She knew that. But they were the one concession she allowed herself, and she packed them in the tin with the kind of care a person gives to things they cannot afford to lose. The best soil on her property, she discovered after 2 days of testing and digging, ran along the western edge, right up against the survey line. The eastern section was drier and rockier, and the center of the plot, while workable, was too shadowed in the afternoons by a stand of cedar trees to be reliable. The western boundary, though. The western boundary was rich and dark, and when she dug her fingers into it, it held together the way good soil does, the way it promises you something. She planted her garden on the property line. She measured twice, using the survey chain she had borrowed from the clerk's office, and she determined where her land ended and the Wallace parcel began. Then she planted right up to that line, tucking her tomato seedlings and her bean seeds and her marigolds into the good dark earth, with a focus so complete that she did not hear the horse until it was close enough that she could smell it. "That line," said a voice behind her, "is not where you think it is." Nora did not jump. She had made a decision, sometime in the past year, not to be startled by men on horseback. She sat back on her heels and looked up. The man on the horse was somewhere in his early 30s, lean in the way that outdoor work makes a person lean, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and a jaw that seemed to have been set with some strong opinion behind it. He wore a practical brown coat, boots that had seen considerable distance, and an expression that suggested he had ridden over here with every intention of being reasonable, but was already reconsidering. "Tobias Wallace," Nora said, not as a question. He seemed slightly thrown by that. "Yes, ma'am." Nora Bell. She did not stand up. Her knees were in the dirt, she had seeds in her hands, and she saw no reason to arrange herself differently just because he had arrived. "The survey map I have places this line right here." "The survey map you have is the one your husband commissioned," Tobias said, and his voice was careful, the way a man's voice gets when he is trying to be civil while disagreeing. "My survey puts the line 4 feet to the east. 4 feet is significant." "It is." She looked at him for a moment, then looked at the seedlings she had already pressed into the ground. Moving them now would damage them. She had exactly the right number for the space she had planned, and she had measured everything based on the line she stood on. "Do you have your survey documents with you?" she asked. He blinked. Apparently that was not the response he had anticipated. "Not on my person." "Then we have a disagreement that cannot be resolved this afternoon." She turned back to her planting. "I would suggest we both take our documents to the county clerk and have them compared properly. Until then I intend to continue." There was a silence long enough to let the wind through. Nora kept her hands in the soil. "Mrs. Bell," Tobias said finally, "I understand you're new here." "I am. And I'm sorry about Gerald. I didn't know him well, but he seemed like a decent man." Something in her chest moved, but she kept her voice even. "He was. I just think it would be better for both of us if we get the line settled properly before you put more into the ground." "I agree completely," Nora said, "which is why I said we should take our documents to the county clerk. That is a settled line. Would Thursday suit you?" Another pause. Then, reluctantly, as though the word cost him something, "Yes." "Good." She patted the soil around a tomato seedling. "Thursday it is." She heard him turn the horse. She listened to the hoofbeats move away and did not look up until they were gone. Then she let out a slow breath, sat back, and looked at her row of small green starts pressing against the dark Texas earth. "Hold on," she said to them, the way her mother used to talk to plants, the way women who grow things often end up talking to the ground. "Just hold on." The ride into town on Thursday was 11 miles by the road that followed the creek bed, and Nora made it in her wagon with the mule she had purchased from a family named Ortega who lived 4 miles north. The mule's name was apparently Conquistador, though the Ortega children had been calling him Connie, and Nora had settled somewhere in the middle with Con, which he seemed to accept with the weary dignity of an animal who had been through many phases. She arrived at the county clerk's office at 9 in the morning and found Tobias Wallace already there, standing outside the door with both hands in his coat pockets and a rolled document under his arm. He looked, if anything, more composed than he had on horseback, which Nora found slightly annoying. She had expected him to look defensive. He did not look defensive. He looked like a man who had prepared his argument and was quietly confident in it. The county clerk was a man named Mr. Peavy, who wore spectacles on a chain and had the mild, permanent expression of someone who had spent 20 years listening to people argue about land and had developed a philosophical immunity to it. He spread both surveys on the desk, weighted the corners with a glass paperweight and a coffee cup, and studied them for a long time without speaking. Nora and Tobias stood on opposite sides of the desk and did not look at each other. "Well," Mr. Peavy said at last. "Well," Nora said. "They're both wrong," he said. "The original government survey from 1869 puts the boundary line between these two parcels at a point that neither of these maps is consistent with. Mr. Bell's survey has it too far east, and yours, Mr. Wallace, has it too far west." "Then where is it?" Tobias asked. Mr. Peavy tapped the older map with one finger. "About 2 feet from where Mrs. Bell's garden currently sits, on her side." Nora turned her head to look at Tobias. He was looking at the map. A muscle in his jaw worked slightly. "So my line is correct," Nora said. "Your line is very close to correct," Mr. Peavy said carefully. "Within 2 feet, which, for a property dispute, is essentially correct." Tobias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The 2 feet puts part of my irrigation ditch on her land." "Does it?" "It does." Mr. Peavy peered at the map again. "That appears to be the case, yes." Nora looked at Tobias again. He was looking at her now, and for the first time she had a real chance to study his face without him being on horseback and her being in the dirt. He had brown eyes, dark and straight-looking, the kind that did not slide away from things. He looked, she thought, like a man who was uncomfortable with being wrong and was trying to behave well anyway. "The irrigation ditch," Nora said slowly. "How long has it been there?" 12 years, Tobias said. "My father dug it," she nodded. Something in her softened, not much, but enough. "If the ditch stays, it's no burden to me. It runs along the property line and it's not in my garden." He looked at her with something that was not quite surprise and not quite gratitude but lived somewhere in the middle. "You're sure?" "I'm sure it's no burden. I'm sure the legal question is one you should probably settle properly with Mr. Peavy at some point, but I have no objection to the ditch." He was quiet again. Then he said, "That's generous." "It's practical," Nora said. "I don't have money or time for a legal fight and the ditch isn't hurting anything. Practical is different from generous." She was not sure why she said that last part. She said it the way she often said things, quickly and a little too plainly, and then she felt the slight awkwardness of it settling in the air between them. But Tobias Wallace looked at her, and something in his expression shifted just barely from wariness into something else. Not warmth exactly, more like recognition, the way people sometimes recognize a kind of thinking in another person that matches their own. "Practical, then," he said. "I appreciate it either way," they thanked Mr. Peavy, who seemed relieved to see them leave without incident and walked out into the dusty main street of Lockhart, which in 1878 was still more ambition than city but was doing its best. The morning was clear and already warm, the way Texas mornings get in April when the wind hasn't come up yet. "Where's your wagon?" Tobias asked, not with particular warmth but not without it either. "Down by the feed store," Nora said. "I needed to get cornmeal." "I have a wagon too," he said, which was not exactly a riveting contribution to the conversation, and Nora had the impression he knew it. "I'm going past the feed store." They walked in the same direction, not quite together and not quite separately, through the morning dust of Lockhart. A group of cowboys on the far side of the street were loading a pack mule with enough rope to lasso a county, and somewhere down the block a blacksmith's hammer was marking out a slow rhythm. "Did you grow up in San Antonio?" Tobias asked. "No, Tennessee originally. Gerald and I came to Texas 7 years ago." She looked at the street ahead. "You're from here, born here." "My father settled this land in 61. He died in 66. "I'm sorry." "Thank you." A pause. "It was a difficult time." She understood what he meant. 1866 in Texas was not a simple year for anyone, and she did not push the subject. The war had left marks on everything and everyone, and some of those marks were still raw enough that decent people left them alone. "Gerald drew plans for a farmhouse," Nora said, and she was not sure why she offered it. "He had blueprints for a porch with rocking chairs." Tobias was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to build it?" "Eventually," she said. "When I have money and when the roof stops leaking." "What's wrong with the roof?" "The south section came down in a winter storm. I've patched it with canvas." He stopped walking. She stopped too and looked at him. "Canvas won't hold through summer storms," he said. "I know. Do you have timber?" "Not yet." He looked at her for a moment in a way that was evaluating but not unkind. "I have extra cedar planks from when I repaired my barn, not enough for a whole roof but enough for the south side." Nora looked at him. "Why would you give me cedar planks?" "I wouldn't give them," he said. "I'd sell them, reasonable price." She considered this. Her $43 had become $31 after the mule purchase and the flour, and she was watching every cent with the focus of a person who knows exactly what is between them and catastrophe. "How reasonable?" she asked. $2 for what you'd need." That was reasonable. That was genuinely, surprisingly reasonable. She studied his face for any sign that this was the kind of offer that came with complications attached, the kind men sometimes made to women alone on farms, and she found none. He was looking at her the way a neighbor looks at a neighbor, nothing more. "All right," she said. $2. He nodded once. "I'll bring them by Saturday." He brought them Saturday, loaded in his wagon with 2 extra planks that he said were a mistake in the count, though she suspected they were not a mistake at all. He also brought, without mentioning it, a paper bag of roofing nails that he set on the porch step as though they had simply appeared there on their own. Nora noticed the nails. She did not say anything about them. She handed over $2 and a glass of well water, and they stood in the spring morning looking at her damaged roof with the particular silence of 2 people who are trying to figure out what they are to each other. "I can help you put them up," he said. "I can manage." "I know you can," he said, and it did not sound like a challenge. It sounded like he meant it. "But cedar planks are heavy for one person." She thought about that. "Are you asking because you want to help or because you think I'll fall off the roof?" The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the shadow of a smile, the country where a smile would eventually settle. "Both, probably," she laughed. She did not entirely mean to, but she did. It came out before she could stop it, a short, real laugh that surprised her, and she saw him blink as though it surprised him too. "Fine," she said, "but I'll be up on the roof too. I'm not going to stand in the yard and direct." "I wouldn't expect anything different," he said. They repaired the roof that afternoon, the 2 of them on opposite sides of the peak, passing nails back and forth, fitting the planks into the existing structure with the slow, careful work of people who understand that doing something right the first time is not optional when you only have enough materials to do it once. The work was quiet but not uncomfortable. They talked in the occasional, necessary way of people working alongside each other, when it mattered and not when it didn't. At one point, Nora misjudged the angle of a plank, and before she could correct it, Tobias reached across and steadied it with one hand. And for a moment their hands were both on the same piece of wood, and she was looking at the side of his face in the afternoon light, and there was something there that she could not name, and so she did not try. "Got it," she said. "Got it," he agreed, and they went back to work. When it was done, the roof held. She could tell by the sound, the solid, settled sound it made when the wind moved through it, that it was good work. She stood in the yard and looked at it with the particular satisfaction of something accomplished, and Tobias stood beside her looking at it too. "Thank you," she said. "I'll accept another glass of water," he said. She brought him water and stood on the step while he drank it, and in the late afternoon light of a Texas April, with the cedar smell still on both of them from the planks, she thought that Gerald would have liked this man. Gerald had always had a good instinct for people, even if his instincts about land surveys had been somewhat optimistic. "The garden is looking good," Tobias said, nodding toward the western edge of her property where her rows were already showing their first pale green. "It's early," she said. "The marigolds will come up last, they always do." "What are they for?" "They keep pests off the tomatoes," she said. "And they're pretty, that's 2 reasons." He looked at her with that same expression she had seen in the clerk's office, the one that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition but was somewhere in between. As though she kept saying things he had not expected, he handed back the glass and put his hat on. "I'll be going," he said. "Cattle need checking before dark." "Of course." She held the door. "Tobias," he turned. "The planks and the nails and the roof," she said. "It was a good neighbor thing to do. I want you to know I see that." He looked at her for a moment that stretched just slightly longer than a moment ordinarily does. "You're a good neighbor too," he said at last. "The ditch." "The ditch," she agreed. He touched the brim of his hat and went to his wagon, and she watched him drive back across the land between their properties, and she thought that in a different life, or maybe in this one, that could be the beginning of something. May came in with heat and determination, and Nora's garden grew the way good gardens do, when the soil and the water and the attention are all aligned. Her tomato plants climbed the wire frame she built from salvaged fence wire. Her pole beans wound up their steaks with the cheerful efficiency of things that know exactly what they are meant to do, and her marigolds bloomed in a line of yellow and orange fire along the property line that was so bright it almost hurt to look at when the afternoon sun hit them straight. Tobias Wallace could see them from his property. She knew this because she could see his property from hers, and his land was largely open except for a long barn, a solid farmhouse, and the cedar breaks that ran along the northern edge. She noticed, sometime in late May, that his kitchen garden, which ran along the back of his farmhouse, appeared to be struggling. The soil on that side of his house was pale and thin, and even from a distance she could see the plants were undersized and yellowing at the edges. She would have minded her own business entirely if she had not seen him crouching over the rows one afternoon, with the defeated posture of a man who has tried several things, and none of them have worked. She drove Khan and the wagon over to his property, which was the first time she had crossed the boundary onto his land. He looked up from his kitchen garden when he heard the wagon and stood slowly, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Nora," he said. The use of her first name was not deliberate, she thought, just natural in the way that sometimes happens after people have fixed a roof together. "Tobias," she said, "what have you tried?" He looked at the garden, then back at her. "Compost. Water. Moving the rows further from the house shadow. None of it's helping." She climbed down from the wagon and walked to the edge of his garden and crouched exactly the way she had been crouching in her own soil that first morning he had ridden up. She dug her fingers in and felt the earth. "The pH is wrong," she said. "Do you have any wood ash?" "In the smokehouse. Mix it into the top 6 inches, about 2 buckets for this area." She stood and looked at the rows. "Your squash is too close to your beans. They're competing. Move the beans to the end row." "How do you know that?" He asked, not dismissively, genuinely. "My mother grew everything," Nora said. "From the time I could walk, I was beside her in the soil. She said the ground would teach you more than any book if you were willing to learn the language." He looked at her. "That's a good way to put it." She was a good woman. Nora looked at the struggling plants with something between sympathy and assessment. "The soil here isn't bad, it just needs working. Give it the ash and move the beans and water in the evening, not the morning, because the afternoon heat evaporates it before the roots can take it." He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't have to come over." "I know," she looked at him. "But you spent your Saturday afternoon on my roof." That shadow of a smile crossed his face again, a little more fully this time, and she noticed that when it settled it changed his whole expression, took some of the seriousness out of it and replaced it with something that was considerably warmer. "I'll get the ash," he said. They worked in his garden for 2 hours, which was longer than either of them had intended. Nora directed and Tobias worked. And then the roles reversed naturally so that she was moving beans and he was testing the ash mixture. And somewhere in the middle of it, they stopped having a reason to be formal with each other and simply worked the way 2 people work who are comfortable in each other's presence. He brought out a tin coffee pot and 2 cups at some point, and they sat on the back step of his farmhouse in the long golden light of a Texas evening and drank coffee and looked at the improved garden rows. "Gerald planted a garden back in San Antonio," Nora said. "A very small one on a rented patch. He was not very good at it." "Was he good at other things?" "He was good at hope," she said. "That's not a small thing. Most of the time it's the largest thing there is." She looked at the coffee in her cup. "He bought this land on hope. The fact that I'm sitting here is because of it." "I'm glad you're here," Tobias said. He said it simply, the way honest people say things without decoration or calculation. She looked at him. The evening was going purple-blue at the edges, and a night bird was singing somewhere in the cedar, and he was looking at her with those straight dark eyes, and she felt something in her chest that she had not felt in a long time, something warm and faintly terrifying. "I think I'm glad too," she said. She drove home in the early dark, and Khan was steady on the familiar road, and she sat in the wagon looking at the sky full of Texas stars and trying to understand what she was feeling. She told herself it was the coffee. She told herself it was the relief of having a roof that held and a garden growing and another human being nearby who was not entirely impossible to talk to. She did not entirely believe herself. Tobias came over the following Tuesday to tell her that the wood ash was working, that the squash was already visibly more upright, and that the beans he'd transplanted to the end row were taking hold. She gave him half a dozen tomatoes from the first of her early harvest because he had an expression when he said the word tomatoes that told her he had been missing them and did not know how to say so. He stayed for supper. That was not planned. She had been making a simple stew and had made too much, the way she always did, a habit from years of cooking for two, and he had been about to leave and then turn back at the smell, the way people turn back at the smell of a good stew, and she said there was plenty, and he said he did not want to impose, and she said it would go to waste, and he said all right if she was sure, and she was sure. They ate at her small table by the window with the evening coming down outside and the marigolds still visible in the last light, burning orange along the property line. She had fixed the front door hinge. The cabin was not beautiful, but it was increasingly livable, and she had pinned a piece of blue calico above the window that caught the light in a way that made the room feel less austere. "Where did you learn to cook?" he asked. Not idly. He asked the way a man asks a question when the answer interests him. "Tennessee," she said. And then from Gerald's mother, who was from New Orleans and had opinions about every ingredient. What was her name? Marguerite. Nora smiled at the memory. "She sent me off to Texas with a recipe for a Creole pepper sauce written on the back of a prayer card. And I have used it exactly twice because I can't always find the right peppers. But when I can, it's extraordinary." He smiled at that, a full smile this time, and she saw all the way into it, saw the warmth there that he mostly kept stored somewhere behind the directness of his face. "My mother could cook," he said. "She died when I was 19, fever. I'm sorry, she meant it. She would have liked your garden," he said. "She grew things, not well, the soil here being what it is, but she tried every year." "What's her name?" "Ada." He looked at the table. "Ada Wallace." Nora let the name sit for a moment. Outside, something moved in the cedar, a night animal making its quiet business, and the wind came through the window gently. "Tell me about the Wallace property," she said. "All of it." And he did. He talked for a long time about his father coming from Virginia in 1861, about the war years and how they had almost lost the land twice, once to debt, and once to a man named Cutter who had claimed a boundary dispute that was later proven false. He talked about rebuilding the barn alone, about the cattle herd he had been building since his father died, about the seasons here and how each one was different from anything Tennessee or Virginia could prepare you for. She listened. She was a good listener. Gerald had always said so, had called it her greatest quality in a way that was loving, but that she had sometimes thought was also a little bit lazy, because listening is easier to receive than it is to give. When Tobias finished talking about the land, she told him about Tennessee, about the hills that were so green it almost seemed absurd, about the creek that ran behind her parents' farm where she had learned to fish and swim and be mostly unafraid of water. She told him about moving to San Antonio at 19, about Gerald and his schemes that were always slightly too large for their circumstances, and that she had loved him for anyway. By the time she realized the evening had passed entirely, the candle was guttered low on the table and both of them had to squint slightly to see each other. "I should go," he said. "You should," she agreed, but did not move. He did finally, standing and taking his hat from the hook by the door where she had hung it without thinking. He stood in the doorway for a moment, the night behind him big and dark and full of stars. "Thank you for supper," he said. "Thank you for the roof," she said. It was the second time she had said that, and she knew it, and by the way the corner of his mouth moved, so did he. "You'll come by on Friday," he said. It was not quite a question. "I'm working the south fence line. I could use another set of eyes on the corner posts." "I know nothing about fence posts," she said. "You know everything about everything else," he said, and it was so plainly said, so without strategy, that it knocked something loose in her chest. "Friday," she said. He put his hat on and walked into the dark, and she stood in the doorway and listened to his horse move away and thought about the way he had said she knew everything about everything else. And she pressed her hand flat against the doorframe because she needed something to hold onto while she figured out what was happening to her. June burned down into Caldwell County with the force of something that had been saving itself all spring, and the days were long and merciless and golden, and Nora Bell and Tobias Wallace moved through them in an orbit that was becoming, gradually and undeniably, smaller. She went over on Friday. She knew nothing about fence posts, but she was not useless at it either, and she held the posts steady while he drove them, and she handed him wire when he asked, and she brought a canteen of water and they drank from it in the noon shade of the cedar breaks, and she noticed that he smelled like cedar and hard work, and something underneath those things that was simply him. He came to her garden on the following Tuesday to help her string new wire for the tomatoes that had grown past the original frames. He came on a Thursday after that to ask if her bean harvest had started because he had a trade to propose, some of his eggs for some of her beans, since his hens were laying well, and her flock of 3 was not yet fully reliable. She accepted the trade, and they stood at the property line handing things back and forth across it. And she thought that this line, this surveyed boundary of 2 feet and complications and cedar planks and roofing nails, had become the most interesting border she had ever stood on. "I notice," she said one afternoon in late June, when they were both working the soil on their respective sides of the line, she planting a second round of squash and he digging out a section of hard-packed clay near his irrigation ditch, "that you have started a garden on your side of the property line." He looked up. He had, in fact, in the previous 2 weeks, extended his kitchen garden from behind his house to a new row that ran along his western edge, right alongside the survey line. His rows were not as accomplished as hers, but they were earnest, and he had clearly been paying attention. "The soil is better here," he said. "You told me that." "I told you the soil was better on my side. You told me the good soil ran along this line," he said, meeting her eyes. "I investigated. Turns out it's better on both sides." She looked at him for a long time. He looked back. The marigolds were blazing between them, orange and yellow and impervious to the heat. "Tobias Wallace," she said. "Nora Bell," he said. They stayed on their respective sides of the line, but neither of them moved, and the afternoon sun was on both of them, and the garden was growing on both sides, and the marigolds were there between them like they had always been there, like they were the real survey marker, and everything else was approximate. "I think," Nora said carefully, "that we are spending a great deal of time together." "We are," he agreed, "and it is generally pleasant." "Generally," he said, and there was warmth in it now, easy and clear. "Specifically," she amended, "it is specifically very pleasant." "It is," he said. He put down his shovel. He took 3 steps along his side of the line until he was standing directly across from her with only the marigolds between them. His expression was serious and warm in equal measure, which she had come to understand was his most honest face. "Nora, I want to ask you something." "Ask." "Would you come to the Lockhart 4th of July celebration with me?" He said it plainly and steadily, the way he said all serious things. "As my companion, not as a neighbor." She looked at him across the marigolds. She felt the warmth of the day and the warmth of the question in equal parts, and somewhere underneath both of them was the warmth she had been carrying since the first evening he had said he was glad she was here. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." Something shifted in his face that was wonderful to see. The seriousness did not leave, but the warmth expanded around it, filled it up, made him look younger and more open and very much like a man who had just received something he had been wanting to ask for longer than 3 days. "Good," he said. "That's good." "Yes," she agreed. "It is." They went back to their respective gardens and worked through the afternoon, and neither of them said much more, but the silence between them had changed its quality entirely, had become something round and warm and full rather than merely comfortable, And when Nora drove Khan home at dusk, she was smiling and she let herself smile and she did not try to stop. The 4th of July in Lockhart in 1878 was a serious civic occasion, which meant bunting on everything. A brass band that was enthusiastic if imprecise, a barbecue that ran from noon to sunset, and a general atmosphere of communal celebration that was large enough to contain both joy and gossip in equal measure. Nora knew that arriving with Tobias Wallace would be noticed. She was new enough that people were still cataloging her, and he was established enough that people had opinions about him. She had decided she did not mind. She wore her second-best dress, which was blue cotton with small white flowers at the collar, because her best dress was impractical, and she was not a woman who wore impractical things to events where she might need to stand in the sun for several hours. She braided her dark hair and pinned it up with the good pins that had been her mother's. She looked, when she checked in the small mirror, like herself, which was all she had aimed for. He came for her in his wagon, which he had washed, she noticed. The wagon was clean and the horse, a handsome bay named Bishop, was brushed. He himself wore a dark blue shirt and a clean hat and had shaved recently, and he looked at her when she came out the door in a way that made her chin come up slightly and her pace even out because she was not going to let herself be overwhelmed by the way a man looked at her. "You look very fine," he said. "You cleaned your wagon," she said. He smiled at her fully. "I did." "That's the nicest thing you've done," she said, and he laughed, and she decided she loved the sound of it because it was real and unguarded and warm. They drove to Lockhart together in the morning light, and he was easy company, which she already knew but appreciated anew. He pointed out things as they passed: a red-tailed hawk on a fence post, a new homestead going up north of the creek road, the place where, as a child, he had once lost his father's best mule for 3 days in a stand of mesquite. She told him about the time she and Gerald had driven a wagon from San Antonio to a cattle fair, and had ended up a day off course because Gerald had been too proud to admit he was reading the map upside down. They arrived in Lockhart laughing, and it felt like arriving somewhere together, not just in the same vehicle but in the same direction. The day was wonderful in the scattered, imperfect way that good days are. The barbecue was extraordinary, and Tobias found them a spot in the shade of the courthouse where they could sit with their plates and watch the brass band misplace the melody with great confidence. They were introduced to several couples and neighbors, and Nora took note of who greeted Tobias with warmth and who greeted him with the careful politeness that meant there was history. He was clearly a man who was trusted and respected, which was consistent with everything she had observed, and she found it confirmed something she had already come to believe. Mrs. Hannah Cooper, who was about 60 and appeared to run the social landscape of Lockhart through sheer force of character, found them in the afternoon and looked at them both with the frank assessment of a woman who had nothing to lose by being direct. "You're the Bell widow," she said to Nora. "I am," Nora said. "You've done good things to that cabin I drove past last week. Roof looks solid." "Thank you, I had help." Mrs. Cooper looked at Tobias. "I see." Then, apparently satisfied with whatever she had seen, she nodded. "He is a very dependable man, Mrs. Bell. I have known him since he was 9 years old. He is quiet and he is stubborn and he is honest as the day is long. If I were 40 years younger and unattached, I'd have made a play for him myself." Tobias looked mortified in a way that Nora found entirely endearing. "Thank you for the information," Nora said gravely. "Use it well," said Mrs. Cooper, and moved on with the majesty of a woman who has said what she came to say. Nora pressed her lips together to keep from laughing. She looked at Tobias, who was examining the middle distance with the studied concentration of a man pretending nothing had just happened. "Quiet and stubborn," she said. "She means well," he said, "and honest as the day is long. Mrs. Cooper is very observant," he said, which made her laugh again. And he looked at her with that full smile, and the afternoon was gold and warm, and the band had found the melody again, briefly, and everything felt exactly as it should. When the sun was going down and the town was thinking about fireworks, they walked along the main street in the early purple evening, and their hands found each other somewhere between the courthouse and the hotel, not dramatically, not with declaration, but with the quiet certainty of something that had been moving in this direction since two people had looked at each other across a property line, and something had clicked. His hand was warm and calloused, and held hers with the same steadiness that was in everything he did. She looked at their joined hands once and then at the street ahead and felt something settle in her, something that had been unsettled since Gerald died, something that had not been fully at rest in a long time. The fireworks were magnificent, as Texas fireworks generally are, which is to say spectacular and dramatic and louder than seemed entirely necessary. They watched from the wagon bed, sitting side by side, and when the largest one went up and lit the sky in a cascade of red and white, Tobias turned and looked at her, and she was already looking at him, and the light was on both of them. "I have been wanting to tell you something," he said. His voice was quiet and careful, the way it got when he was saying something important. "Tell me," she said. "I have not had anyone to care for in a long time," he said. "Not since my mother. I am not practiced at it, and I may not always be good at it, but I find that I want to try, with you." He looked at her steadily, the way he did all things. "I want to try." She was quiet for a moment. The sky above them was still trailing light from the last burst. "I was very much in love with my husband," she said honestly. "I want you to know that because I think you deserve to know it. He was a good man and I loved him, and I am not going to pretend that it was simple or quick to lose him. I would not want you to pretend otherwise. But I am also not going to pretend," she continued, "that this, whatever this is not something, because it is something. I know the difference, and this is something." He reached over and took her hand again, and his thumb moved across her knuckles in a small, deliberate gesture. "Then we will let it be something," he said. "Yes," she said. "We will." They drove home under the stars, and he walked her to her door, and they stood on her fixed porch in the warm night, and he kissed her. It was not the kind of kiss that declares something for the first time. It was the kind of kiss that confirms what both people already know, quiet and certain and genuine, like a handshake on a deal that both parties fully intend to honor. She stood on the porch for a long time after he drove away, with her hand on the doorframe and the marigold still faintly visible in the starlight along the property line, and she felt the kind of full that she had not expected to feel again. July passed in the serious business of summer, the heat and the garden and the daily labor of frontier life, all of which continued regardless of whether a person's heart was occupied or not. Nora's tomatoes produced abundantly, and she found ways to sell the surplus to Mr. Hargrove at the general store, who grumbled about the price but bought them consistently, which told her what she needed to know about his actual opinion. She preserved beans and squash in the root cellar. She spent 2 weeks extending and shoring up in preparation for winter, working with the methodical forward-thinking that Gerald had always admired and had sometimes teased her about. "Gerald said I planned too far ahead," she told Tobias one afternoon while he was helping her move heavy stone from the creek bed to shore up the cellar wall. "He said I was already living in next year while he was still in last week." "He sounds like he balanced you out," Tobias said, moving a stone that required both arms. "He did," she said, "and I balanced him. He'd have had more fun without me pushing him to be practical. I'd have had more security without him pulling me into hoping for things." Tobias set the stone in place and looked at her. "Which do you think is worse, too much practical or too much hope?" "Too much practical," she said immediately, and then paused. "But not by much. You need both. The trouble is when they're in the same person in the wrong proportions." "What's the right proportion?" She thought about it. "More practical than hope on most days, but enough hope that you'll plant a garden on ground you've never seen because someone you love described it to you in the way that made you believe it." He was watching her with that expression again, that deep-looking one, and she met it without looking away. "I think," he said, "that you have the proportions exactly right." She looked at him for a moment. "You barely know me," she said. "I know you enough," he said. He said it simply as a fact, the way he stated all facts. She handed him another stone. "Then help me finish this wall." He laughed, and she smiled at the sound, and they finished the wall as the afternoon went long and blue, and she thought that this was what she had not known she was missing. Not just love, but the kind of easy, working partnership that makes love feel like more than feeling, makes it feel like something you build. August brought a problem that had nothing to do with gardens or fences or the good soil along the property line. A man named Dale Rourke came through Lockhart with a string of horses and a lawyer, which was the kind of combination that usually meant someone was going to have a bad month. Rourke was a land speculator, the kind who had appeared in Texas during the Reconstruction years and never entirely left, and he had apparently purchased several debts from the Caldwell County Bank that had changed hands twice since the war. One of those debts, he claimed, was attached to the original survey of the Wallace land, a claim from a creditor that had never been fully cleared. Nora found out about it on a Wednesday when Tobias came to her property in the middle of the afternoon, looking as though someone had set a fire under something important, and he was still deciding whether to fight it or move out of the way. "Tell me," she said. He told her. The claim, apparently, was for a surveying debt from 1864 that Tobias's father had owed to a firm in Austin. The debt had passed through several hands and now Rourke held it, and Rourke was arguing that, because the debt was tied to the survey of the property, it gave him some legal standing over the land itself, which was, as far as Nora could tell, a significant overreach of what debt law in Texas actually permitted, but it was the kind of overreach that required a lawyer to prove. "Do you have a lawyer?" she asked. "I have $42, he said. So no, she thought. She had grown her surplus earnings to $60, which was not much, but it was something. "There is a lawyer in Lockhart, Mr. Alderman. He did the work on my deed at a reasonable rate. I know who he is. Go talk to him, don't wait." "Nora, I don't want you to offer me money," he said, and she could see him lining himself up to be stubborn about it. "I wasn't going to offer you money," she said, which was slightly untrue but not entirely. "I was going to suggest that you go talk to the man today, this afternoon, before Rourke has more time to establish his position." He looked at her, and she could see him deciding between the instinct to be independent and the instinct to be practical, and she waited to see which one won. "Come with me," he said. She did. She drove into Lockhart with him in his wagon, and they sat in Mr. Alderman's small office on the west side of Main Street, and the lawyer, who was a precise man with very clean hands and a remarkable memory for Texas property law, listened to the full account of the debt, and examined the documents Tobias had brought, and then set everything down on his desk and looked at them. "The debt is real," he said, "but the claim on the land is not. A surveying debt is a personal obligation, not a lien on the property unless it was registered as such at the time of the original survey. Was it registered?" "I don't know," Tobias said. "We can find out in about 40 minutes, Mr. Alderman said. "The county records from 1864 are here. Come back after lunch." They came back after lunch, and Mr. Alderman had found his answer. The debt had not been registered as a property lien. It was a personal obligation of Tobias's father, which had died with his father as an uncollectible debt, and Rourke had no legal standing whatsoever to use it against the land. "He knows that," Mr. Alderman said. "He's hoping you don't." "Men like Rourke always do that," Nora said. Both men looked at her. She shrugged. "They find people who look like they might not know their rights, and they make large official-sounding claims. Gerald almost lost his rented property in San Antonio to the same type of thing. The answer is documentation and a lawyer." Mr. Alderman looked at her with mild surprise, the kind reserved for women who say useful things in his office, which apparently was not a frequent occurrence. "That is precisely correct, Mrs. Bell." Tobias had Mr. Alderman write a formal response to Rourke's claim, which they sent that afternoon, and Rourke, who was indeed counting on ignorance rather than substance, moved on from Lockhart within the week. He did not go quietly or graciously, and he made some remarks in the general store about Wallace and his widow neighbor that Nora heard about second-hand from Mrs. Cooper and found not worth repeating, though she noted them. What she did not note until later was the way Tobias had taken her hand in the wagon on the way home from Mr. Alderman's office, not the tentative hand-holding of the 4th of July, but firmly, with purpose, as though he had decided something. "You did that," he said. "You knew what needed to be done," she said. "You just needed someone to say it plainly." "Why did you come with me?" he asked. "You didn't have to." She looked at the road ahead. Con was pulling steadily, the afternoon light was long, and the answer was honest and simple. "Because your land matters to you the way mine matters to me," she said, "and I wasn't going to sit at home while someone tried to take it." He was quiet for a long moment, holding her hand. "Nora," he said. "I know," she said, and they drove the rest of the way home in that particular silence that is not silence at all but the sound of two people understanding each other. September came in slow and golden. The summer's work showed itself in the cellar, full of preserved goods in tight jars lined along the shelving Nora had built with her own hands. The garden was winding toward its autumn form, some plants exhausted and pulled, others still giving their last rounds of produce with the stubborn generosity of things that have been well tended. Along the property line, the marigolds were beginning to fade, their bright heads going to seed, but they had done their work all summer, and the tomatoes had been extraordinary. Tobias had a good garden of his own now. Not as accomplished as Nora's, but genuinely good, the soil improved by 3 rounds of amendment and careful watering, and his squash had come in strong enough that he had his own surplus. He had added a row of sunflowers along the property line that faced south, and were so tall and cheerful that Nora could see them from her bedroom window every morning, a row of yellow suns that made waking up feel like an occasion. She had told him about the sunflowers when she first noticed them, and he had said he had put them there because they would hold the soil at the line, and because he thought she might like to see them, and she had pressed her hand against her mouth for a moment because it was such a careful, deliberate kindness that it had made her throat close in the good way. One evening in mid-September, they were sitting on her porch after supper, which had become a frequent enough occurrence that there was now a particular chair that had become his chair by usage, and the evening was soft and cool, in the way Texas evenings get in September when summer finally steps back and lets some air through. He said, "I have been thinking about something." "Tell me," she said, which was what she always said. "The property line," he said. She waited. "It is a good line," he said. "The government survey line, it has served us well." "It has," she said. "I have been thinking that it would be a good line to live on both sides of." He was looking at the evening sky, but she could see the edge of his expression, and it was serious and warm in the way she knew meant he was saying something important. If the person on the other side was willing, she looked at him fully. He turned and met her eyes. "Tobias Wallace," she said. "Nora Bell," he said. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I am," he said. "I am asking you on this porch in September in a fairly direct manner because I am not a man who knows how to be indirect about things that matter to me." He reached into his coat pocket and took out a small ring, simple silver with a turquoise stone that was the color of the Texas sky in the middle of a clear day. "This was my mother's, Ada's. I'd like you to have it if you'll have me." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought about Gerald, which she was allowed to do, and she thought about the land, and the roof, and the garden, and the sunflowers, and the 4th of July, and his hand around hers, and the way he said her name like it was its own complete sentence. "I will have you," she said. "I will very much have you." He put the ring on her finger, and it fit as though it had been made for her, which she would think about later as one of those small, uncanny kindnesses the world occasionally provides. And then he kissed her, on the porch in September, with the marigolds dying their beautiful gold death along the line between them and the sunflowers still standing tall in the last evening light. They were married in the first week of October of 1878 by the Reverend Marsh at the small Methodist church in Lockhart, which was full enough with neighbors and Mrs. Cooper and the Ortegas and several of Tobias's long-standing fellow ranchers, that the narrow pews were crowded, and the air was warm with the heat of bodies and goodwill. Nora wore her best dress, which was dark green with cream lace at the collar, and she carried a small bouquet of the last dried marigolds from the property line garden, because she had pressed and dried them for exactly this purpose without telling anyone. When Reverend Marsh asked who gave this woman, Mrs. Cooper, who had apparently appointed herself to this role without consulting anyone, said, "We all do," in a voice of such confident authority that the Reverend simply moved on. Tobias kept his eyes on Nora's face through the whole ceremony, and when he said "I do," he said it the same way he said all the things that mattered, plainly and steadily and with everything behind it. She said "I do" and meant every syllable. They had a small celebration at the Wallace farmhouse afterward, which was now to be their house, though the plan was to use Nora's cabin during planting season and busy periods. Mrs. Cooper brought a cake. The Ortegas brought tamales that were better than anything Nora had eaten in years. Old Mr. Hargrove came and stood in the corner and ate 3 plates of food without speaking to anyone, which was Mrs. Cooper informed Nora, his way of showing affection. Nora stood in the middle of her wedding reception in October in Texas and looked around at this collection of people and thought about the seed tin her mother had given her, and the 2 trunks, and the $43, and the canvas over the bedroom corner, and the first morning she had driven stakes into the good dark earth along the property line. She thought about what it meant to plant something and wait. She thought about how her mother had been right, that the ground will teach you more than any book if you are willing to learn its language. She thought about what it meant to be home. Tobias appeared beside her with 2 glasses of the cider that someone had brought, and he handed her one, and he stood next to her looking at the same room she was looking at. "Happy?" he asked. "Enormously," she said. He touched his glass to hers and kept his arm against hers, and she leaned into him slightly, just slightly, and he was solid and warm and certain, and outside the window the 2 gardens, one on each side of the survey line, were going to their autumn sleep in the October evening. Winter 1878 settled over Caldwell County with a seriousness that reminded everyone that the Texas climate, for all its warmth, was not to be taken for granted. The first hard frost came in November, and Nora and Tobias spent a long weekend draining the irrigation lines and covering the root cellar properly and moving the cattle to the southern pasture where the cedar breaks gave them some shelter. They worked well together in the way she had known they would, which was not always without friction, because they were both stubborn people who had strong opinions about how things should be done, and there were moments of genuine disagreement that required the kind of direct negotiation that neither of them was too proud to manage. Tobias had a way of doing things that his father had done, and some of those ways were good and some were simply habit, and Nora had a way of seeing better methods that was sometimes blunt to offer. They had learned already that the best outcomes came from her saying what she saw plainly and him thinking about it genuinely rather than defensively, and they applied this system with reasonable success to everything from fence maintenance to kitchen storage. In December, when the work was lighter and the evenings were long, they sat by the fire in the farmhouse, and Nora would read aloud from the 2 books she had brought from San Antonio, a volume of essays and a novel that she had already read 4 times but that held up to repetition, and Tobias would work on something with his hands, mending tack or carving a new handle for a tool, and the fire would settle and outside the Texas winter would do its quiet work, and inside they were warm together. He had built, in October before the cold set in, the beginning of the porch Gerald had dreamed about. He had not said much about it. He had simply started building one evening when she was in the garden doing final cleanup, and when she came around the corner of the cabin to see what the hammering was, he was already 2 posts in and had a clear plan for the rest. "Gerald's blueprints," she said, understanding immediately. "You showed them to me in the fall," he said. "You had them in the trunk." She had shown him the envelopes. She had not known he had studied them enough to build from them. "It won't be finished before winter," he said, "but I wanted to start it." She stood looking at the posts and felt something that was love and grief and gratitude all mixed together, which was sometimes what life felt like when it was being fully lived. "It's a good start," she said. By December she knew she was expecting a child. She told Tobias on a quiet Sunday afternoon when the fire was going and the house was warm and he was mending a piece of harness. She sat down across from him and said, "I have something to tell you," and he looked up and she told him. He was very still for a moment. Then he set down the harness and came to where she was sitting and crouched in front of her and took both her hands in his. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and what she saw in his face was something that she had not seen there before, not even on their wedding day, which had been wonderful, but now there was something more open and more vulnerable than she had seen in him, something that looked like wonder at full strength. "A baby," he said. "A baby," she said. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead gently to hers, and they stayed that way in the firelight for a long time, not saying anything, because there was nothing to say that the moment was not already saying. Spring came back to Caldwell County in March of 1879, with the same wild optimism it always did, all wind and green, and the smell of wet earth after the first real rain. Nora was 6 months along and showing fully, which did not prevent her from planning her garden with the same precision she always brought to it, though she had adjusted her approach to account for the fact that extended crouching was no longer comfortable. Tobias had taken on more of the heavy work without being asked, and without making it into a thing. He turned the soil along the property line row, he hauled the compost, he strung new wire where the tomato frames needed replacing. She directed, and he worked, and the arrangement suited both of them because she knew exactly what needed doing and he wanted to do it, and they both understood that this was not helplessness on her part, but simply the division of labor that the season required. They planted together on a warm morning in early April, 1 year almost exactly from the day Nora had planted her first garden alone along the survey line. She planted on her side and he planted on his, and the marigolds went in along the line in the same row they had been in the year before, a new generation of seeds from the same stock, and the sunflowers went in north of them where they would catch the best of the afternoon light. 1 year, she said. He looked up. He was on his knees in the soil on his side of the line, which was still technically the line, though what it divided now was less a border than a meeting place. 1 year, he agreed. A great deal has happened, she said. Yes, he said, it has. He looked at her and then at the garden along the line and then back at her. Do you know, I think this is the happiest I have ever been in my life. She felt the fullness of it, the roundness of this moment, this spring morning with the seeds in the ground and the baby moving under her hands and the man she loved across the marigold row. Yes, she said. Me too. More than you expected, he asked. She thought about it honestly because she was an honest woman and he deserved honest answers. In a different direction than I expected, she said. The happiness I expected to have was the happiness Gerald had planned. This is something I grew myself, which is perhaps why it feels the way it does. He was quiet for a moment and she could see him absorbing this, turning it over in his careful mind. Does it feel like a different kind? He asked. From before, she looked at him. It feels like the same country, she said. Just a part of it I hadn't seen yet, both real, both mine. He nodded slowly. Thank you for telling me that. Thank you for asking, she said. Some men wouldn't. Some men are fools, he said, and went back to his planting. She went back to hers, and the marigolds went into the ground between them, and the morning was clear and warm, and the birds were everywhere. Their son was born in July of 1879, on a Tuesday evening, with the sunflowers in full height along the property line, and the tomatoes at their peak, and the whole land smelling of summer and growing things. He was delivered by Mrs. Harmon, who was the midwife in Lockhart, and Mrs. Cooper, who had simply appeared at some point during the afternoon and taken charge of the kitchen, which no one had thought to object to. Tobias was allowed in as soon as it was over, which Mrs. Harmon made very clear was a privilege and not a right, and he came in and looked at the small red person that Nora was holding against her chest, and he looked like a man who has stepped into a room where the light is completely different from any light he has ever stood in before. "He has your expression," Nora said. "That one you get when you're thinking about something serious." "He's 2 minutes old," Tobias said. "Early starter," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed, very carefully, as though the whole room might tip. She put the baby into his arms with the sure hands of a woman who had held babies before, and watched his face while he held his son for the first time. "James," he said. It was the name they had agreed on for both their fathers, Gerald's middle name and the name Tobias had proposed. "James Wallace," she said. "Hello, James." The baby blinked in the lamplight, enormous-eyed and uncertain, which was reasonable given the circumstances. Tobias held him with the careful deliberateness he brought to everything important, and Nora lay back against the pillow and watched her husband hold their son, and felt the fullness so completely that it left no room for anything else. Mrs. Cooper appeared in the doorway with a look on her face that was almost soft. "He's a big, healthy boy," she announced, for her own confirmation apparently, since she had just been present for all of it. "Well done, Nora." "Thank you, Hannah," Nora said, using Mrs. Cooper's first name for the first time, and something happened in Mrs. Cooper's expression that was definitely soft, definitely unguarded, definitely the face of a woman who had been hoping to be called by her first name for several months. "I'll warm some broth," she said, and disappeared. Tobias looked at Nora over the top of James's small round head. "You called her Hannah." "I did," Nora said. "She's been trying to get you to do that since July." "I know," Nora said. "She has earned it." He smiled, and James made a small sound, and the summer night was outside, the window full of stars, and the garden was sleeping along the property line, the marigold standing sentinel in the dark. James Wallace grew into his name with the same determination that good plants grow in good soil. He was a sunny child, which surprised Tobias and delighted Nora, because she had expected, given both their parents, to produce a child of notable seriousness. But James laughed easily and constantly, and had Gerald's talent for hope in his father's face, which was a combination that made everyone who met him feel immediately fond of him. By the time James was old enough to pull himself up along the property line fence, which Tobias had built not as a dividing structure but as a low rail that marked the line without blocking it, he was walking the length of the garden as though he owned both sides of it, which in a sense he did. The porch was finished in the spring of 1880. Tobias worked on it through the mild months, expanding what he had started in the fall before James was born. And when it was done, it was exactly what Gerald had drawn on those envelopes, wide enough for rocking chairs at both ends. Nora had 2 chairs, which she had ordered from a furniture maker in Austin with the money from 3 seasons of garden surplus, and she put one at each end. She stood back and looked at it on the morning it was finished, with Tobias beside her and James on his hip pulling at his collar with the focused determination of an 8-month-old who has decided that buttons are the great project of his era. Gerald would have been pleased, Tobias said. He would have been insufferable about it, Nora said. He would have told everyone for a year. She smiled at the porch. I would have loved it. Tobias looked at her. Do you still miss him? Yes, she said. Not the way I did, but yes. He is part of everything that brought me here. I miss him the way you miss a road you've already traveled. You know you can't go back on it, but you're grateful it led you where you are. He put his free arm around her and she leaned against him, and James grabbed a handful of her hair, and the morning was clear and endless above the Texas land. This is the porch, she said. It is, he said. Sit with me. They sat in the rocking chairs at opposite ends of the porch with James between them on a blanket on the boards, and the marigold garden was just beginning its spring start along the property line, barely visible yet, Just the first tentative green, but there. Always there. The years that followed moved with the rhythm of seasons and work, and the particular grace of a life well built. The garden on the property line grew every year, tended first by Nora, and then alongside James as soon as he could be trusted with a trowel, which was not as young as he thought but younger than Tobias expected. Tobias's side of the line grew better every year, because Nora had been teaching him the soil's language with the same patient care her mother had used, and he was a willing and attentive student. In 1881, a second child came, a girl they named Ada May, for Tobias's mother, and because May was the month she was born, and because she arrived in a burst of spring so confident and forceful that it seemed appropriate to name her for the season. Ada was, from her first weeks, nothing like James in temperament. Where James laughed easily, Ada assessed carefully. Where James went toward new things, Ada circled them and made her decision from a considered distance. She had Nora's chin and her directness and her habit of stating things plainly, which meant that by the time she was 4 she had opinions about the garden that were worth paying attention to. "The beans are too close," Ada said at 4 years old, standing in the garden row with her small hands on her hips and her father's serious eyes looking at the plants. "You sound like your mother," Tobias said. "Good," said Ada, and moved a bean seedling with 3-year-old Nora taught confidence that made both her parents press their lips together. Nora watched her daughter in the garden and felt the thread that connected her to her own mother, to the woman in Tennessee who had taught her that the ground speaks if you listen, and thought about how knowledge passed from hand to hand, woman to girl, season to season, as real and persistent as seeds in a tin. The property line garden was famous in Caldwell County by 1882. Nora had never set out to make it famous, but it had the quality of beautiful, useful things, which is that people notice and remember them. Travelers who came through on the main road that ran north of the property would remark on it. The line of marigolds and tomatoes and sunflowers and pole beans that ran so straight and abundant along the surveyed border of 2 farms that had stopped being separate the moment a woman and a man had both decided to plant their best things in the same direction. Mrs. Cooper told everyone the story, which she had shaped over time into something slightly more cinematic than the actual sequence of events, involving, in her version, Nora arriving with seeds and Tobias arriving with stubbornness, and both of them planting right up to each other across the line, until love was the only logical resolution. This was not entirely inaccurate, and Nora did not correct it, because she had come to understand that Mrs. Cooper's storytelling was a form of love, and you do not correct love. Mr. Hargrove, for his part, bought Nora's garden surplus every season with less grumbling and more regularity, until by 1882 she had a standing account with him that was one of the more reliable financial relationships in the county. She had expanded her preservation operation, and in the fall she traded preserved goods to 3 neighboring families in arrangements that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the old economy of the frontier, the economy of what you had and what someone else needed, and the dignity of exchange between equals. Tobias's cattle herd had grown to a size that required 2 hired hands, brothers named Victor and Samuel Delgado from a family that had been in Caldwell County since before the war, and Nora knew them both as good men and treated them accordingly, which was not, she knew, universally true of the families they worked for, and which she did not think about without some anger at the injustice of a world that sorted men by the accident of their birth. She said something like this to Tobias once directly, and he had said that he agreed, and that his father had not always been right about everything, and that some things you learned to do better than the generation before you even when it was not comfortable to do so. She had loved him a little more for that. The spring of 1883 was a particular one. Nora was 32 years old. James was nearly 4. Ada was 2, and already stealing seedlings to replant in locations she considered superior. The farmhouse had been expanded with a new room, and the cabin had been fully repaired, and was used for storage and occasionally for James's napping, which he required in the manner of a person who has had a very full morning. They were planting the property-line garden on an April morning when Tobias stopped digging and looked up at the sky, which was the specific shade of blue that Texas produces in early spring, so clear it seems like it goes up forever. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. He looked at her across the garden row, across the marigold seeds they had just put in the ground, across the line that had been the beginning of everything. "5 years ago," he said, "I rode over to that line to tell you it was in the wrong place." "I know," she said, "you were wrong." "I was wrong about the line," he said, "but I was right to ride over." She smiled at him across the garden in the April morning. "You were," she said. "I think about it sometimes," he said. "How close it came to not happening if I'd decided to wait, if you planted 10 feet east and I'd never had a reason to come over. But the good soil was here," she said. "We both knew it was here." He looked at her. "Is that what brought you to this side?" "Yes," she said, "and then you." He came around the end of the row, around the marigold line, to her side, and kissed her in the middle of the garden in the April morning with the seeds in the ground around them. And she kissed him back with the full warmth of 5 years and everything they were. Ada appeared from behind a tomato frame with dirt on her face and a seedling in each hand, and looked at them with the dignified disapproval of a 2-year-old who has important work to do. "Planting," she said, meaning it as instruction. "We are planting," Nora agreed, stepping back and accepting the seedlings from her daughter's hands. "You're right." "Put these here," Ada said, pointing at a spot with the confidence of someone who has thought about it. Tobias looked at the spot. "She's right," he said. "It's a good spot." "Of course I'm right," said Ada Wallace, at 2 years old, crouching down to demonstrate. Nora looked at her daughter in the soil and felt her mother in her heart and felt Gerald in the impulse to hope, and felt the long line of women and men who had bent over the earth and pressed seeds into it and waited and believed. She pressed a marigold seed into the ground on her side of the line. On his side, Tobias pressed 1 in 2. Ada pressed 3 in at the spot she had selected, which was not exactly on the line but was close enough. The morning was clear. The county was quiet. Bishop the horse was grazing at the south fence, and Con, who had developed a philosophical disposition in his old age, was standing in the shade of the cedar near the barn. James came running from the house with his boots on the wrong feet and both hands full of what appeared to be biscuit, which he deposited with no particular ceremony between the plants. "What is that?" Tobias asked. "For the ground," James said. "Biscuit," Nora said. "The ground should have breakfast too," James said with the unassailable logic of a 4-year-old. Tobias looked at Nora. Nora looked at Tobias. Ada looked at both of them as though this was all very inefficient. "He might not be wrong," Tobias said. "He might not be," Nora agreed. She took her son's boot off and put it back on correctly while he ate the rest of his biscuit, and her daughter rearranged seedlings, and her husband went back to his row, and the property-line garden grew in all directions on an April morning in 1883, and everything that had been planted, in the soil and between 2 people, and in the life they had built together on both sides of a surveyed line, was growing. There would be another child the following year, a boy they would name Gerald for the man who had bought the land on hope, and Gerald Wallace would be a dreamer like his namesake, but with his mother's practical hands, which turned out to be an excellent combination. He would help his father expand the herd and his mother expand the garden operation until it supplied not just Mr. Hargrove's store but 2 others in the county, and he would grow up on a farm where the property line between 2 parcels of Texas ground was marked not by a fence, but by a row of marigolds so bright and persistent that they came back year after year from the seed of the season before, rooted in the soil where 2 stubborn, tender people had once decided to plant their best things as close to each other as the law permitted. The rocking chairs were on the porch, both ends. They used them every evening when the work permitted. Tobias with his coffee and Nora with her tea, and the children running in the yard until dark called them in. The marigolds bloomed every summer along the line. The sunflowers stood every August in tall golden rows that Nora could see from her bedroom window. The soil along that boundary was the richest soil on either property, worked every year and given back to every year, which is the only way any good thing sustains itself. Sometimes in the evening, when the children were in and the porch was quiet, and the Texas stars were doing their extravagant best above them, one of them would say something about the beginning, about the morning with the stakes and the horse and the property line, and they would sit with it for a moment the way you sit with a thing you could not have predicted and would never trade. The line was still there. It was always there. But it had become, over the years, not a border between two separate things but the center of one thing, the place where two gardens met and grew together, where two people had looked at each other across the good dark soil and decided that what was between them was worth tending. Nora Bell had arrived in Caldwell County with a seed tin, 2 trunks and $43, and she had planted her garden on the property line between herself and a stubborn, honest, sunflower-planting man who had not moved his garden from that line either. And neither of them ever had, and the marigolds came back every year to mark the spot where everything had started, and the porch was wide, and the chairs were full, and the land held everything they had given it and gave it back in full. That was the whole of it, and it was more than enough, and it was exactly right.